Alright, hi everyone, welcome back to another video of Salesforce Makes Sense. This is Himanshu and we are continuing our journey of understanding Salesforce development through our Apex curriculum. In the previous tutorials, we talked about future methods, we talked about queuable methods, and which were the part of asynchronous Apex, which means a transaction can run independently outside of the sync job, wherein we get a good set of fresh governor limits, right? Now the third thing we'll be looking at is batch jobs. Now, where do batch jobs come into picture? Why do we need them? How do we use them? What could be a use case? We'll be discussing all of that in this tutorial. All right. For those of you who are new to this channel and who are looking at this video as the very first video, I believe this is the 99th video that I've created on Apex curriculum. I suggest you start with chapter 1 because reaching here will basically build a lot of confidence once you start from the right chapter and you follow that sequence. All right, let's get started. Now, what is batch Apex and where does it come into fruition and why do we need it? The primary agenda or the primary idea behind Salesforce platform providing us batch jobs so that we can run our code for records in batches or in chunks. Right now, we all know that there are governor limits to everything because we are on a multi-tenant architecture. There are socle limits, there are DML limits, everything has an upper limit, right? Now, what if you have a requirement wherein you have to work on, let's say, 5 million account records? How do you query that kind of data? Will you be able to query using a normal socle query? Will you be able to iterate over it? No, because the maximum limit is 50,000, right? Now, whenever such sort of governor limits come into picture, when you have a lot of data that you cannot imagine and the data could be huge and you need to do something on that data, what do you use? You use batch Apex. So whenever the governor limits to process records touches the roof, batch Apex comes to the rescue, right? Now, if you're looking to process thousands of records, batch Apex is the way to go. A batch job breaks down your data into chunks of manageable jobs and executes them one by one, which is why it is called a batch job. Now, what does this mean? This means, let's say you have 50,000 records, all right? And the batch size that you have defined is, let's say, 50. So your code will execute 1,000 times and it will only pick 50 records at once. That's how working in chunks, working in manageable set of data, and each job works on that set of 50 records, right? The other advantage is that each transaction or each 50 record batch gets its own fresh set of governor limits, which is beautiful, right? So you don't have to worry about the governor limits at all, right? And in case of failures, the other transactions are not rolled back, meaning if you have 50,000 records and 48,000 records successfully processed, but there were, let's say, 4 or 5 batches wherein those 50 records had some error or some records in that batch had error, only those specific batches will fail, not all. All right, so it is kind of a partial success scenario. It is not an all or none scenario. Make sense? Awesome. Let's talk a bit more about batch Apex and understand a bit more, nomenclature and terminology around it. So batch Apex is exposed using an interface. Now this interface can be implemented and it can be programmatically invoked using Apex, right? Now, wherever we see interface, we'll have to implement it. Implementing an interface is on the class level. All right, we have read a bit about it. We have understood a bit about it in our tutorials previously, in our queuable classes also. So similarly, for batch class also, you need to implement an interface. What is that interface? It is the database.batchable interface. Okay, we'll look into it. We'll write that code. Don't worry. But for now, let's look at a bit of the things that I've actually written down here. Now, talking about limitation, how many active batch jobs or how many queued batch jobs can you have at a single point in time? So like I said, you might have 50,000 records and you might have each job or each chunk is, let's say, 500 record size, which means 50,000 divided by 500, 100 jobs will run. But at a single point in time, as soon as you execute this batch transaction, the first 5 jobs will be picked up, they will be queued, and then the next 5 will be picked up. Okay, it will not be next 5, it will basically be as soon as the first one is completed, the 6th one will go inside. But at a single point in time, at max, you can have only 5 active jobs, which is why for most of you who have actually hit executed a batch job, when you see that debug log, you will see only 5 at max. You will not see more than that. All right, great. Now, a good use case for using batch Apex is recalculating the sharing of the entire org. that's fine. But like I said, any and every scenario wherein you have a lot of data and you actually need to process it, it does not really depend on that particular time. You can actually do it later, you can actually schedule it. All of those scenarios fall into a use case of the batch job. Okay, I want to send a nightly email to all my clients. Can a batch job do it? Yes. Right? I want to handle and check all the new records that got created and mark a flag every day. Can a batch job do it? Yes. All right. So you can execute the batch using the database.execute batch method. So this is just, you can use it to execute it. We'll look into it. All right. And you can even schedule the batch to run in future by using the database.schedule batch method with a time parameter. Okay. If you want to execute it immediately, use this method. If you want to execute it later, use this method. Okay, and by the time, I hope you have already noticed that all the methods for the batch job come from the database class, right? So if you see this, and now I believe you are for sure confident and comfortable saying that yes, database is the class, dot is the operator to access its methods, and execute batch is a static method that I'm accessing from the database class. Okay, great. Now, since we are actually implementing an interface. Now, what does implementing an interface mean? It basically means that we are kind of overriding what is the capability of that interface, and we are kind of tweaking it to our purpose. So similar to every interface that we do, like for example, in the queueable, we add the execute method, right? Similarly, with batch job, you have to override 3 methods. Now those 3 methods are start, execute, and finish. All right, cool. With a lot of theory done, let's go into VS Code and jump right in and kind of create a new Apex class. Okay, so I'm going to say create Apex class, and I'm gonna call it batch for opportunities. All right, let's just go ahead and create it. I'll get rid of the constructor and I'll get rid of the sharing keyword here, and I'll just keep it the default no sharing. Right now, what's the first thing I need to do to make this class a batch class? I need to implement an interface, right? What is that interface? That interface is database.batchable. All right. And this database.batchable is basically takes a primitive it takes the S object as the data type. Okay. So basically it kind of tells you that this particular class will run as a batch job for S objects. It can be any S object. It can be opportunity. It can be account. It can be ABC__C. It can be any object in the system. Okay, done. The base setup is done. Now let's go ahead and deploy it. Okay, as always, I'll take you through the errors, and yes, we have the errors. Now what happens is, as soon as you say that this particular class is a batch class, see the compilation fails and it tells you have to implement the method. Which method? Start, execute, finish. Awesome. We got the error already, right? Cool. So now we have to actually override 3 methods for us to be able to even successfully deploy it. Start, execute, finish. All right. Let's go back to my keynote and let's see. Yes. So we'll start with the start method, right? We'll start with the start method. The start method is the very first method that we'll have to override, and this method is a bit unique. All right, this method is responsible for querying and collecting all the records that you actually need to process. So like I said, 50,000 records that you want to process, where do you fetch it? Where do you query it? In the start method. All right, makes sense. Once you have this information available in the start method takes it forward and passes it to the execute method. All right, now to be able to write this method, how do we normally write a method? We write public static, let's say list of account, and then the method name is start method, right? This is how we normally write it. Now with the start method, you have certain changes. First of all, every method that you have in the interface has this fixed parameter called database.batchable context. This basically tells the system that these methods are basically coming from the interface database.batchable. Not much logic to it, but just remember it. You need the context in all the 3 methods. Okay, so the first method I've created, I've put in this particular context variable as the method parameter. The other thing we need to do is the return type. What should be the return type here? the return type will basically be a list of records. Correct? So for it to be a list of records, I have to use a database return type, which is called query locator. Now you'll be like, Himanshu, what is this, right? This is the first time we are using a dot operator in a return type here. Correct? But this beautiful thing enables you to actually query as many records as you want without getting that governor limit hit. So the query locator is a very smart record retriever, if we can say it like that, right? What it will do is it will actually fetch data from the database and pass it to the execute method in chunks. So you will never get that particular governor limit error. All right. So what I am going to do here is I'm going to say return database. Now to be able to return something that's of type database.getQueryLocator, we'll use the getQueryLocator method. All right. And what this accepts is a query. Now what is this query? It's a query that we normally do. All right. And this has to be basically put in a, now how do we normally write a query? We write it like this within the third brackets, right? The square brackets. However, when you write it as a string and you pass it to the database method, you have to make it a string. It will not be with the brackets. So this is how you write a query. So far, so good. Awesome. So we have written a very simple query. We have declared the variable and we have passed it to the get query locator, because this will return records of type database.queryLocator, and this will in turn be fed to the execute method. All right. Great. Right. So we have the start method ready. Let's go ahead and try to deploy this and let's see if we still get 3 errors or 2 errors. Okay, if you see, 1 error has been reduced and I'm now getting only 2 errors, execute and finish, because I've not written them at all. Okay, and if you notice, the error is very much clear. You see the method parameters are also given, similar to what we defined here. Okay, so if you see this, you have the finish method that's pending. So what I'll do is I'll create the finish method. Again, if you remember what I said, it will also contain the batchable context. Correct? Right? I'll just create it by default and I'll go ahead and say deploy. Now only 1 error should remain. Only 1 error, which is the execute method. So that's what we'll look at next. But before jumping into that, there are 2 more things I'll talk about. First, Himanshu, what if I use the query method instead of the query locator? You can even use this, right? But this particular value that it will return is not capable like the query locator. It would be a plain query, and this might fall short of because of the governor limits. Okay, so always in batch, get query locator is preferred, so that you get the query locator, and then this chunk of chunk of manageable records can be passed to the execute method. So always query locator. Interview question: why query locator versus query? What's the difference? This will be under the governor limits. This will be smart enough to handle the workload in chunks. All right. Great. So that was our start method. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the finish method. So start kind of tells you, okay, go ahead and start the batch. What does finish tell you? All right, everything is done. Anything else you want to do, do it here. So as soon as all records of all chunk jobs, meaning all iterations, is complete. Oh wow. Finally, the finish method will run. Make sense? So any kind of post processing that you want to do, any kind of final notifications, cleanup, storing some value, you can do here in the finish method. All right. That's what the finish method is for. If I take you to the start method, we already looked at it, right? This method returns the database.queryLocator or an iterable object. Pretty much the same thing. We use database.queryLocator. You can also use an iterable. Even iterable has the same property. All right. To the execute method, it passes that information. If we use database.queryLocator, the governor limit for the number of rows retrieved is bypassed, which means you can query all your records in the scope up to 50 million records. That's why query locator and not query. Okay. All right. Let's talk about finish method because that's very small and short and sweet. The finish method executes all the post-processing operations. Things like sending out emails can be done here. And after all the independent individual batches are processed, the finish method is called. Okay. Awesome. Now let's go to the execute method, the main method, the real deal of the batch job. So the actual processing of the records happen in the execute method. Each batch or set of records is passed through this method and that chunk is executed. Okay, it takes two parameters. First one will obviously be the batchable context, and the second one for the execute method, what do you need? The set of records, right? So it takes the list of object records. Let's go ahead and write it up. I'll say public. I don't think this should be static. Let me just remove the static keyword and I'll just say public void execute. Again, I'll take the database.batchable context as the first parameter. And the second parameter is going to be a list of S object. We normally call it scope for that particular batch, right? Now it can be S object, it can be a specific object that you know. So you know that you are querying your opportunity, right? So you can actually just say list of opportunity, even that is allowed. Do all the hard work here. If I go ahead and say deploy now, ideally the batch job or the class should be deployed. You see, it's finally deployed and it has created a class in our Salesforce org. Awesome. So we created a batch class. All right. So we're good with the interface. We are good with the method params for each method, and we are good with what is the method type, right? Start, execute, and finish. Now, a very simple thing. How many times do you think each of these methods will execute? Let's say you have 10 records. All right. And let's say you have defined the batch size as 1, meaning each time the execute method should take 1 record. All right. So what happens? The start method runs, queries the 10 records. All right. Gives it to the execute method one by dot. Finally, all the 10 records completed. And then finish method executes. All right. Now I want you to comment on this video and tell me for this particular scenario, how many times did the start method run? How many times should the execute run? And how many times the finish method runs? Okay. If you write it down, you will be sorted in terms of the order of execution of this particular batch class and how things actually work behind the scenes. All right. Just go ahead and comment it. I'm not going to reveal the answer here. I'll just let you know if you're right or wrong. Okay. Cool. Now, before jumping in, let me go back here and let's talk about a use case. All right. This use case tells you to write a batch to run it nightly that fetches all the opportunities that have been marked closed in the past 7 days. For all the parent accounts associated to the opportunities, add a task for the account owner to congratulate the user for the same. Okay. A lot of words, a very long sentence. Let's break it down. What do we need to do? We need to write a batch. When should it run? It should be scheduled to run every night. Okay. What do you really need to do and which object is it? It is the opportunities object. Essentially, only those opportunities that have been marked closed in the past 7 days, meaning closed one, right? Because you want to congratulate, right? You cannot congratulate a closed lost opportunity. But let's say closed one or any random status. Okay, we'll pick anyone. In the past 7 days, meaning only the last 7-day record should be filtered out. Okay. Once you have that data set, you take a look at that opportunity record and you see who's the account owner, the parent account's owner. You create a task for that particular person and the task should basically contain the subject to congratulate. Very simple. Okay. You can put a due date, you can put a priority, you can put a status, and you can put the subject as congratulate your opportunity user, whatever. Okay. So that's the primary idea. So that tells me if I have to write a batch job, I have to query my records in the start method. So what will I say here? I'll say where stage name equals closed one. Now let's first of all jump into Salesforce. Query select id comma name from opportunity And then let's also query the stage name. All right, let's see what kind of stages do we have. So I don't see closed one, but let's see perception analysis. All right, so let's pick up this particular stage. How many such opportunities are there where stage name equals perception analysis? We have 2. Okay, let's pick something that's more maybe, or it's okay. All right, let's pick this 2, right? So I'll just paste this value here. Perception analysis. Now if you notice, there's a problem here. My query is within single quotes, and then I'm writing the query with, let's go back. I'm writing the query here with a single quote on the stage name because it's a string literal. So Salesforce is not able to understand because it's kind of confused. According to Salesforce, you see the thing is ending here, right? And it's treating it as a completely different thing. If I try to save and try to deploy, this will throw an error, right? How do you solve this kind of problem? You can actually escape your single quotes which are inside. So what you need to do, simply put a backslash before your single quote that's used inside. That means it will treat it as a single quote as part of the query. Save, and now let's deploy. Let's see if the error still shows up or not. All right, deployed fine, right? So this is how you can escape single quotes. This is called escaping your single characters. All right, so we have put the stage name filter. That's the first filter we put. What's the other thing we need? Closed one. Okay, this should be perception analysis in the past 7 days. Now, how do you figure out past 7 days? You can either create a formula or something like that, right? Or you can even do it in the query. How do you do it in the query? You can put things like and close date is greater than last n days 7. This evaluates to last 7 days automatically. This is available in-house from Sockle, right? It does not return any records. Let me just switch and just say less than. So I have the 2 records. Okay, we'll tweak our parameters based on whatever data is available so that we can work on some data, but you get the idea, right? So some of us would have actually went ahead and created a formula here, right? Date, today's date is equal to, you will take date dot new instance, and then you will actually say today's date minus 7, and then you'll use that in your query, right? Instead of doing all of that, if we are smart and we know that the Sockle provides this kind of attribute, your problem is solved in a single line, right? So we'll pick this up and we'll take it in our query. Sorted, right? So now if I deploy this, this should also deploy fine. All right. So now tomorrow, if you have more filter queries that come in, what you can also do is you can actually segregate your query into a base query and a filter query. Let's say you have made it metadata driven and you have made it like, you know, something more generic. You can actually just do something like this. You can keep your base query somewhere, and then you can keep your filters somewhere, because you might have n number of filters, right? So instead of using a plain query directly here, you can now do something like base query plus filter query, right? And I have not added a space here. I have not added okay, I've added a space here, so we should be good, or else the query will fail, right? And we'll take this query and we'll put it here, not here really, in the get query locator. Save, and let's now deploy. Let's see, nothing really changed, but it should deploy. String, it should not be string. Let's deploy one more time. Done. Now how do we ensure that our records are coming in? Ideally, Salesforce says that your records will be shown up in the execute method, because that's what will run, right? So what I can do is I can say for, I think the autocomplete Einstein is already giving me that information. Amazing. For opportunity op, in what? In this particular variable scope, because this is the list of records that will come from here, right? I'll simply print it out first of all. Okay, op.name. Now when I do op.name, immediately my head goes to the query. See, I just have ID, I don't have name. So let's bring that information, or else it will say Socle S object row was retrieved without querying, right? I mean, it will say you that, you have to put that in the comma separated list to be able to access it. All right, that's all. Let's go ahead and try to deploy it. And then finally, let's say system.debug finish method called. All right, and I'll say system.debug start method called. All right, let's go ahead and try to deploy this. Now, once this is deployed, which ideally it should be, we'll go back to Salesforce, and what we'll do is we'll try to execute it. What was the execution funda? It was database dot execute batch, and we can create an instance of our class. So how do you create an instance? By using the new keyword and then putting a bracket, right? And now if you want to add a parameter of how many records do you want to process as the batch size, meaning 150, whatever, you can put that here in the second attribute. If you do not put it here, by default, the batch size is always 200. Make sense? Awesome. So now what I'll do is I've just set batch size is 1 because I want to show you how many times the execute method runs. For those of you who have commented, you will see your answer now. I'll go ahead and say remove the logs, remove the open log button. I'll go to the logs here and I'll say execute. So if you see on the logs, anonymous code executed, and you see the batch apex has run. We have some chunks that have been handled, and finally the batch apex has closed. You see 36, 37, and then 38. Now let's open the batch apex. Let's take a look at the debug only. See, start method called here. Awesome. Let's open the closing batch apex. Let's take a look at the debug only, finish method called. Let's open the chunks now. Chunks is the first name is here. The second name is, where is the second name? The second name is here. So you have two serial batch apex chunks which have your record. In the third one, there's no record, so you don't have to worry about it. Okay, so there are these two chunks wherein your record exists and it is being processed, meaning the execute was called twice. Right? Awesome. So now you know how many times your start will be called? Only once per batch. How many times the finish will be called? Only once. And execute will be called for how many batches do you have? Like the total number of records divided by the batch size. All right. Great. Now on that note, I also want to take you to Salesforce and I want to show you the different kind of statuses that you can see on the Apex jobs page. So whenever you run something asynchronous, you can go to Apex jobs and you can see the status for it. Okay, I've just gone to setup, and if you see at 9:49 p.m. I gave a job type of batch which is completed and it processed 2 batches. Simple as that. So it's giving you how many batches did it processed. So because our size was 1, it took 2 records. So one per batch. So there were 2 batches. All right. What was the Apex class and what is the job ID if you want to look at more information about that job, success, failure, and stuff like that. Who submitted it? Himanshu. At what time it got completed, and everything is mentioned here. All right. So that kind of tells you, right, like what all statuses are available. So let's look at what all batch job statuses are available. We looked at what? Completed, right? Completed meaning job has been successfully completed with success. However, when it starts with holding, queued, preparing, processing, aborted, completed, or failed. Now each one of them have a different meaning. Now what will happen normally? If Salesforce resources are available, your job will be awaiting execution first. Then the start method will be called to fetch all the records. Once all the records are available in the start method, the processing will start. Each execute method will run, so it will process until all your batches are completed, right? If everything is done, it will go ahead and mark it complete. If something went wrong, it will say it has completed, but there is a failure. So it will say failed. And if you want to terminate it in between, let's say 1,800 batches are running, it is taking too long and you've seen that everything is an error. So you can abort it. You can delete the job from the Apex jobs page. Okay, and let's say Salesforce is going through a very hard time wherein a lot of jobs are running, so it does not have the resources to start, so it will hold your job until it has available resources to execute it for you. Okay, so job has been submitted and is waiting for resources to be executed. Available is holding. Once it is available to execute, it will be queued and it will be taken into the pipeline. It will execute the start method, and as long as the start method takes time, it will be preparing. Now, why is this a relevant stage? Because see, if you have 50 million records, it will take time to prepare the data set, correct? That's why it will be in preparing mode. And for 50 million records, if the batch size is 200, how many batches would be there? So it will process each one of them. So you'll see processing. And then finally, once everything is done, it will either be completed or failed. Make sense? So if whatever we discussed till now makes sense and you're still awake, just type in bad job makes sense, right? Just type in the comments, bad job makes sense. All right. Awesome. So now going back to the use case, I see that I've not done the use case here, but that is something for you to do, right? The hard work here is something that you should do right now, because based on whatever you have learned, you are well equipped to actually do this problem statement here. What is the problem statement? All you have to do is actually write the logic to create tasks for your parent accounts, which are part of this opportunity. So for each opportunity, you need to identify account owners and create a task for each one of them. All right, each one of them. That's all you need to do. Now what you can do is you can write this code on your own. What I'll do from my side is I'll give you this particular snippet, okay, which has the query and everything, and you can actually modify the query so that you get your records properly, and then you write the code here and give me the snippet with the updated code. Okay, the first comment on this video will be the snippet, code snippet. You can take it from there, and from there build on top of it and just comment back with the updated answer. All right, don't just type it out and just give it back, but give it a try, debug it, try to execute it and see how it runs. If it is running fine, and then you can submit it to me on the comments. All right, what do you get if you have a right answer? You get confidence, right? Because you have written that code yourself. Cool. That's all around bad job. Let's move on to more topics around bad jobs. Okay, now you must be thinking like, Himanshu, like what potential use cases could be there for bad job? Like this is fine. I can do mass processing, bulk processing, email notifications, some recalculation. But can I even do things like a call out? If I need data from a third party system, can I bring it and then use it for my CRM database? Yes, you can. But if you have to do it, you have to tell the system that you are going to do a call out. How do you tell the system that you are going to do a call out? By implementing another interface. All right, and that interface is called database.allows callouts. All right, so if I go to VS Code, all you need to do is put a comma here and say that I am going to use this particular batch job for doing callouts. So can you just allow me callouts for this batch? And when you deploy this and the batch job runs, and you have written some code here like HTTP request, and you are kind of doing some integration here, that will basically run and not fail. Okay, if you don't write or implement this interface, what will happen? You will get a callout exception that your batch job does not allow callouts. So you'll get a callout exception. All right. Very simple, straightforward. If you want to do callouts, if you want to call out an external system, what is the interface? This is an interview question. You can actually use database.allows callouts. Perfect. Now, the next thing, another interesting thing that happens here is you have a lot of batches running, correct? Now, if I were to tell you, can you count the number of records that have been processed as part of all the batch jobs, as part of all the batches? Can you give me a count, or can you give me a summary around it? Like how many records passed or how many got inserted? Can you give me a end-to-end summary that contains information from batch 1 to batch X? That becomes a challenge, right? Why does that become a challenge? That becomes a challenge because whatever we do here is fresh. The execute method is always fresh per batch, correct? Now let me show you this. If I go ahead and say public integer count equals 0, and I go ahead and say something like count plus plus. All right, and I want to see the count value in the final finish method. What have I done? I've declared a count variable, which is an instance variable because this is on the class level. I've used that variable in my for loop so that I can just count how many opportunities are coming in my batch. And then finally, I'm seeing that particular count in the finish method. Finally, all the batches are executed. I'll go ahead and deploy this. First of all, this should deploy fine. Deployed fine. And now what I want to do is I want to actually re-execute my batch. I'll go ahead and say execute my batch again with the size 1. So there are two batches that will be processed. Done. Now what I want to do is I want to actually look at my final batch apex where the finish method will show. If you see, it says 0. However, the count was updated twice in these two batches, in these two chunks, correct? So what's the problem here? How do I get that information? If I want the information across all my chunks, how do I get it? That brings me to the next topic, which is stateful batch jobs. What is stateful? It kind of means that you want to preserve the state of certain characteristics of your batch, and if you want to actually keep that with you. All right. So what normally happens, what just happened is, since batch job run in chunks, every transaction is considered as individual and a fresh one, more like a discrete one. So any static and an instance variable that you have will always be reinitialized, which is why you saw that this count equal to 0 got reinitialized at the final stage also. All right, it got reinitialized. You want a better proof? Let me just do something. I'll just print the count in the execute method. Okay, I'll print it here and I'll say deploy. So as long as the execute method is running, the count is getting updated. It is getting updated to 1. But as soon as I reach the final or finish method, it is basically showing me 0, which means it is getting reinitialized. All right, let's see the final batch apex file, which is this one. It is 0 here, but if I open the chunk, see, value is 1. So it means it got refreshed, it got reinitialized. All right. However, if you want to maintain the values across all batch transactions, you can use another interface that's called database.stateful. If once you do that, all your instance variables can hold values across the transaction. Okay. Only instance variables, not the static variables, because static variables have the property of getting initialized only once, right? So what I can do is, this is an instance variable because I've not put the static keyword here. What I can just tell my batch class is, can you allow me to be stateful? I'll just say this. Once I say this and when I deploy is fine. And now if I execute the same batch, executed fine. Let's see. Done. Let's look at the final batch apex file, debug only. You see the value is coming as 2, meaning it kept the promise of being stateful and it kept counting for all execute methods, and it gave me the result at the end for the entire batch apex. Makes sense? Amazing, right? This small thing, just we added an interface and it is able to count all the batches. Looks very powerful, right? Great. So that was stateful. Do I have anything else? Yes, we do have limitations. Now, this is another async apex job, asynchronous job. It has its own fresh set of transactions, governor limits for each execute method. But simple interview question, can a future method be called from a batch class? No, you cannot call a future method from a batch class. But can you call another batch class from this batch class? You can, and you can only do it in the finish method. What does that mean? That means that if you have another batch apex, you can actually just execute it from the finish method, and only in the finish method you can do it, nowhere else. Okay, what this will do is, as soon as the first batch is completed and it's finishing the transaction, it will initiate the second batch. As simple as that. Okay, but can you call a method that's a future method? No, you cannot do that. You'll get an error. Feel free to try it out. Always better to try. All right. Awesome. That is all I had, and I want you guys to do this particular assignment. I'll be sharing this snippet that I have on my VS Code. Go ahead, give it a try and try to write that code. Challenge yourself and see how well you're writing it. What problems are you facing? But I would love to see your final answer on the comment. And yes, that should be all. I think that's all. One last thing, if you noticed, we implemented 3 different interfaces. So can a single class implement multiple interfaces? True, it can. Example is right here. Okay, interview questions are always around how do you make a class, how do you make a batch class call out, you have to do this interface. How do you make it stateful, you have to do this interface. But if you noticed, do we have to override any methods when you are using this interface? No, they are all the same methods: start, execute and finish. Only these three methods as part of the first interface we implemented. All right, then query locator versus query we talked about. This is a powerful tool for more records. It gives you access to 5 million records in a query, right? And then your execute method has a scope parameter which contains all the records, and you do all your heavy work or processing here, and finally the final deadlift is done here, which is the post processing logic. All right, that's all I believe in terms of async apex. Batch apex being the last one. We talked about future method, we talked about queuable, and now we just completed batch apex. So great. In the next tutorial we'll talk about security in apex, and we'll specifically talk about security within apex, like within sockle. How do you check certain things within a method? All right, not sharing settings and not org wide settings, not sharing rules, not that way, more like in apex, like sockle sharing, field accessibility and stuff like that. So just some tips and tricks, we'll talk about that in the next video. So yes, keep watching, keep following, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.